are talking Take Back the Night. This is directed and co-written by Gia Elliott. The other writer here is Emma Fitzpatrick, who also stars in the movie as our main character Jane. Now this is a horror movie with a message, and we have seen a few of these before. This one, I think, it's quite a poignant message and doesn't pull any punches in regards to the obvious metaphor that it is kind of talking about here. We'll come on to that in just a second, but let me give you the broad strokes of the story first of all. So it focuses on Jane. Now Jane is an artist, she's a social media influencer, she's had a troubled past. Her mother had mental problems and actually tried to kill her once. Jane has problems with alcohol, drugs, partying, you know, all of those kind of things. And a little bit out of control, you might want to say. And she goes to this kind of party one night in kind of honour of her sort of art exhibition, and she ends up in the street through circumstance. But there she is attacked by some type of creature, some unknown kind of creature, and she is sexually assaulted. And then she is battered, hurt, ends up in hospital where she's obviously checked over by the medical professionals, interviewed by the police, and obviously kind of recounts her tale. And this kind of creature hasn't finished there and seems to be wanting more of Jane. Now what will happen? You'll have to watch the movie to find out. So this movie, as I say, works on two levels. The service level, it's a creature feature. We have this monster kind of stalking this character. How will she escape? That's kind of your basic service level creature feature. However, the other thing is this movie is obviously a metaphor for sexual assault, and also the putting you through the eyes of the victim. Now, I think you can obviously look at this movie in two ways. You can I suppose you can watch this film and just watch it as a kind of a creature feature. How's the girl going to get away from the monster? I think you can enjoy the movie on that level only. But obviously, the real message here is kind of the metaphors between, you know, the kind of the fantastical version that we're seeing on screen being representative of real life sexual assaults, rapes, things like that, but also kind of like the process of being the victim and how there's a degree of victim blaming and the kind of the trauma that goes through not just the rape itself, but also the kind of the aftermath, having to kind of have the, you know, the very impersonal medical, you know, checkups and interviews, and then kind of people, you know, victim shaming Ken, saying she was asking for it because she was a party girl, all of these kind of things. The movie does a very good job of kind of, I think, making you view these things through the eyes or through the lens of a horror film by changing the kind of like the into a kind of a fantastical setting. You are forced as a viewer to then kind of like experience these things, maybe sometimes not even realising that this is what's actually it's being compared to here. And I think the movie does a good job for the most part without being too heavy-handed. I mean, it is fairly kind of like upfront the whole movie through, but I think it kind of incorporates it into the narrative well through the vast majority of the film, where you can kind of still watch this and enjoy it as a film without feeling like you're actually being preached to, but it still does give you some very kind of clear messages and clear kind of you know, opening your eyes, so to speak, to maybe these things that maybe you wouldn't have considered. There's one or two times where I would say the movie just goes into a little bit of too heavy-handedness, particularly towards the end, but for the most part I think it does it pretty well. I have to say as well, I think the acting here from our main character, Jane, played by Fitzpatrick, is great. I think what I liked about her character as well, and this is less to do with the kind of the metaphor, but more just kind of horror cliches, is that the character of Jane isn't a typical kind of, you know, virginal girl who is always the final girl that you see in these movies. It's a trope that I hate, to be honest with you. And in lots of horror films, as, you know, as I've mentioned, it's always the kind of like the good girl who is the, you know, the ultimately the one who is the survivor here. Here, Jane is, you know, she would be considered probably the first one to get killed off in any other kind of horror film. They make her kind of a person who is not altruistic. She's not kind of like, you know, a virginal kind of like a good girl, so to speak. She's just a kind of a woman who goes out partying and kind of and lives her life maybe a little bit too much in the fast lane, but that shouldn't deter her from, you know, that shouldn't mean that she has to be subjected to, you know, the horrors that this movie kind of puts her through. But I liked it. I thought that was it was just kind of in a horror movie sense. I thought it's nice to have a kind of a character who isn't your typical kind of like goody two shoes and all of that. I actually really like the characters of the police detective who's kind of helping her. Again, quite kind of a nuanced performance and a complex character who has mixed kind of feelings about duty but also a duty of care to the kind of obviously the victim and things like that, and her sister as well, who is much more straight and narrow, more of a career girl, and about putting kind of like career first and compared to family. So this movie has got a whole lot kind of going on with kind of various social issues, and I think for the most part it juggles it pretty well. I don't like being preached to be honest with you, and some of these times I feel that there are movies that would just do that to the nth degree, and you know, hit you over the head with it. And I think 95% this movie doesn't do that, but still kind of does a good job of integrating it into the narrative without feeling like it's kind of strangling you. There's one or two instances where I do feel it does do that, particularly I would say the end 10 to 15 minutes. I think it maybe just kind of lurches into a little bit of more obvious territory, so to speak. But for the most part, it's pretty good. The movie is still pretty exciting, and I think one of the things is that the character work here is so good. Jane feels like a real character, and I think that's the point. It's meant to be kind of more of an every woman, more of a realistic depiction of a modern kind of like person in 2021 and beyond. So outside of the couple of times I say it's a little heavy-handed, do I have any other problems with it? I think the conceit with the monster is a little bit weak. Now, the monster is left deliberately vague in regards to what it is, because the monster is meant to represent attackers at large. It's meant to represent, you know, it's meant to be a kind of a cipher for any type of sexual predator out there. So it's deliberately vague in what it even looks like. We don't really see a proper good look of it, because it's just meant to be that kind of, you know, whoever it might be. However, in the context of the narrative, and now if it was purely just like, you know, this is kind of like a simulation of what it's like to kind of be a victim of like sexual assault, blank here is your kind of attacker, I could be a bit more forgiving. But we have to think of it in the context of the film as a narrative, not just a kind of an infomercial. And I don't think that the creature in the kind of the monster sense was particularly kind of well defined, and I think that's unfortunately the negative effect of doing this, of leaving this kind of thing as a kind of as a metaphor. Really, it ultimately, you know, in the context of the film, we don't know what the hell this is. We don't know why it's got an aversion to bronze. It's something that's kind of introduced but never really expanded upon, and I think that's like the kind of the flip side of the coin of having this as a kind of just a metaphor for a sexual assault, because, you know, it just is. It's just there. There's just a monster. We don't know what it is, and it doesn't like bronze. Accepts it. So that's kind of, you know, it's a little bit ill-defined because of that, as a consequence of, as I say, it just being a very heavy metaphor. There are some weak visual effects here as well, unfortunately. So, as I've mentioned, the monster itself is kept distorted. It has a kind of like a distortion effect around it, again, to use it as their metaphor so you can copy and paste whatever sexual predator you want on there. But nonetheless, it does still have some really kind of wonky kind of CGI, which is also a little bit distracting. It's surrounded by CGI flies. And one of the things that bothers me is the flies just look like they're put in after the fact, because, you know, we never see our victims kind of like wave them away or anything like that. They seem to be completely buzzing around, and our characters are just not affected by it. So it just kind of really stands out as, you know, poor CGI facts, maybe added after the fact when we didn't even think about kind of putting flies in there and things like that. There are one or two conveniences in the story that I feel didn't quite work for me. There's a character, a reporter character, that is kind of has a connection between the detective and the kind of the victim, and that was just a little bit convenient for me. I wasn't quite buying that and the relationship. Again, it's somewhat unprofessional. I don't want to go too much into it, but that didn't quite work for me on a kind of a narrative level. And I have to say, I think the ending, as I've mentioned, wasn't the strongest. But it's I think does a good job. I think the movie wants to, you know, it's more concerned with is kind of making you feel uncomfortable and making you realise the impact of what it is to be a victim. And I do think it succeeds in that. I think it succeeds at the behest of the film as a narrative piece at some point. But nonetheless, I feel that's the priority of this film. That's what it's trying to do. It doesn't completely derail the film as a kind of a narrative. I think it actually works for the most part. But there are some instances here where I feel it still doesn't help the narrative and actually detracts from the narrative in some instances. But I think it does a good job of kind of showing you through the eyes of this victim and what it might be like to kind of experience not just the kind of the attack itself, but the kind of the surrounding, you know, situation that you would have to deal with, or at least that you may well have to deal with. So overall, I do think this is an above average film, and for the most part pretty well made. I'll give it a 6 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.